Hello, this is part 4 of my DVD collection video where I'm going to be talking about my favorite horror films that came out in the 1980s, but if you haven't already, go check out the first 3 parts of this video. Now, the first movie I want to talk about for this part of the video is Stephen King's Cat's Eye, and I love Cat's Eye. Like, yes, it's silly, and it's probably the closest that Stephen King ever came to writing a kids movie, but I love this movie. I think it's a really fun movie, and kind of a cute movie, too. Like, the first 2 segments of the movie are definitely more adult-oriented, but the 3rd segment of the film borders on being a kids movie, almost. Now, Cat's Eye is an anthology film written by Stephen King, and the film stars a very young Drew Barrymore. Now, before this, Drew Barrymore was in the adaptation of Stephen King's Firestarter, so this was not the first time that Drew Barrymore has been in a Stephen King movie. The movie also stars James Woods as well. Now, Cat's Eye is 3 stories in one, however, all 3 of the stories basically take place in the same world, and all 3 stories have a reoccurring character, this cat. Basically, the overall plotline of this movie is there's this supernatural cat that is traveling across the country to get to this little girl played by Drew Barrymore, and it turns out that there's this evil troll that wants to eat this little girl's soul, so this supernatural cat now has to find this little girl so it can protect her from the troll. But the cat doesn't actually get to this little girl until the 3rd part of the movie, but the first 2 parts of the movie are almost like their own stories. Now, the first segment of this movie is based on a short story by Stephen King called Quitters Incorporated, which was published in Stephen King's collection Night Shift, and the second story in this movie is based on Stephen King's story The Ledge, which was also published in Night Shift. The next movie I want to talk about is Silver Bullet. Now, this is based on a book by Stephen King called Cycle of the Werewolf. Now, I have read the book, and I'm a huge Stephen King fan, but I can honestly say that the book, Cycle of the Werewolf, is my least favorite book by Stephen King, and I actually think this movie was an improvement over the novel. Now, the plot of Silver Bullet is, it's about this series of murders that are happening in this small town in Maine, and in the movie, this young boy in a wheelchair, played by Corey Haim, discovers that the murders are actually being committed by a werewolf. But Silver Bullet is a really good movie, and the movie also stars Gary Busey as the main character's uncle, who is freaking awesome in this movie. The next movie I want to talk about is Re-Animator, and Re-Animator is a freaking awesome movie. Now, the film is directed by Stuart Gordon, and this is based on the short story by H.P. Lovecraft called Herbert West Re-Animator. Now, I never read the short story that this movie is based on, so I really can't say what some of the major differences between this movie and the short story are, but Re-Animator is a great movie, and if you haven't seen Re-Animator, I highly recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is The Return of the Living Dead, which is a horror comedy, and the film is pretty much a spoof on Night of the Living Dead, but the film is also kind of a satire on the zombie genre in general, but Return of the Living Dead is a brilliant movie, and if you haven't seen The Return of the Living Dead, you owe it to yourself to check this movie out. The next movie I want to talk about is Day of the Dead, which is the 3rd film in George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead series, the first 2 films in the series being Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, and I love Day of the Dead, and I think Day of the Dead is a criminally underrated film that even today a lot of people crap all over this movie, which I really don't get. Like, I can't say I like it as much as Dawn of the Dead. Like, the thing about the Night of the Living Dead series is you kind of have to like each film in the series for different reasons, but I love the hell out of Day of the Dead, and I think it's one of the most nihilistic zombie films ever made. And the film is extremely gory, and I think the gore effects in this movie and the makeup effects in this movie are some of the best examples of Tom Savini's effects work. The next movie I want to talk about is Demons. Now, Demons is an Italian horror film, and the film is co-written and directed by Lamberto Bava, who is actually the son of famous Italian filmmaker Mario Bava, and the movie is also co-written and produced by Dario Argento. Now, the plot of Demons is it's about this group of people who get trapped in this movie theater, which has some kind of supernatural curse on it, and basically all the people in the movie theater start getting possessed by demons, and anybody who is bitten or scratched by a person who is possessed by demons would also become possessed by demons as well. Now, I love Demons, and this is one of the movies which really got me into Italian horror. The next movie I want to talk about is The Bride. Now, The Bride came out in 1985, and this is kind of a loose remake of The Bride of Frankenstein. Now, The Bride stars Sting as Dr. Frankenstein, and it also has Clancy Brown in it as Frankenstein's monster, and it also stars Jennifer Beals as the character of Eva, who is the bride in the movie. Now, I love this movie, but I would definitely say the best parts of this movie are the scenes between Frankenstein's monster and this dwarf character played by David Rappaport, who is definitely the best character in the whole movie, but I actually really enjoy The Bride. I know there are some people who don't like it, but I enjoy this film a lot. The next movie I want to talk about is Fright Night, which is written and directed by Tom Holland, who would go on to direct Child's Play. Now, I love Fright Night. This is definitely one of my favorite vampire movies, and this movie is actually very close to my heart, because I first saw this movie when I was a little kid. AMC used to play this movie all the time back in 2000 or 2001, back when AMC was actually a movie channel, and that's when I first saw this movie on AMC, and I just fell in love with this movie when I first saw it, and this is one of the horror films that I really kind of blame for my love for horror. Now, when I was 8 years old, that was the age I was at when I first started getting into horror movies, and I was watching, like, the old Dracula movies and the old Frankenstein movies and werewolf movies, and I used to watch this movie all the time when it was on TV, and this film is definitely a tribute to a lot of the Hammer Dracula films, and I just love this movie to death. And this movie also has one of my favorite movie soundtracks of all time. The next movie I want to talk about is a 1986 anthology film called Deadtime Stories, which I have on this DVD set here called Chilling Classics, which is a public domain box set featuring 50 different horror films, which are all in the public domain. Now, I heard, but I don't know how true this is, but I heard that apparently this movie is no longer in the public domain. Apparently, somebody must have bought the rights to it, but Deadtime Stories is a great anthology film. Basically, it's about this uncle who is trying to get his nephew to go to sleep, and his nephew is constantly complaining that there's a monster in his closet, and the monster may or may not be real. But basically, this uncle tells his nephew these 3 stories, and the first story is kind of a fantasy horror story. The second story is a take on Little Red Riding Hood, only with a werewolf, and the third story is a really funny take on the Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. But Deadtime Stories is a really awesome movie, and if you haven't seen this movie, I highly recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is House, not to be confused with the Japanese film of the same name. Now, House is a 1986 horror comedy film directed by Steve Miner, who also directed Friday the 13th Part 2 and Friday the 13th Part 3, and he would go on to direct films like Warlock and Halloween H2O and Lake Placid. Now, House is about this horror writer whose aunt killed herself in her house, and he ends up going into the house and discovering that this house is actually the gateway to another world. But House is a really fun movie, and I would definitely recommend it. The next movie I want to talk about is Critters, and Critters is an awesome movie. Like, if you haven't seen Critters, this is a movie that I highly recommend. Now, the film was definitely made to kind of capitalize on the success of Gremlins. Like, after Gremlins came out, you started to see a lot of these, like, Gremlins cash-ins and Gremlins knockoffs, like Ghoulies and Hobgoblins. But I think Critters is probably the most well-known of all the Gremlins knockoffs, but Critters is an awesome movie, and I definitely recommend it. Now, I have Critters on this DVD set here, where it comes with the 3 sequels that were made to it. The next movie I want to talk about is Troll, which I have on the same DVD as the movie Troll 2. Now, Troll is a fantasy horror comedy about this young boy whose sister ends up getting possessed by this evil troll from another dimension, and now he has to stop this troll and save his sister. And the young boy in this movie, I shit you not, his name is Harry Potter. I'm not joking, that's the character's name in this movie, and this was years and years before J.K. Rowling wrote the Harry Potter novels. The next movie I want to talk about is a Stuart Gordon film called From Beyond, which is based on a short story of the same name by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, I have read the short story that this movie is based on, and really only the first 10 minutes of this movie actually adapt the short story by H.P. Lovecraft, and then the rest of the movie goes off into its own thing, because the short story was really only a few pages long, so obviously to do a full-length movie off that story, they would only have to loosely adapt it. But From Beyond is a really good movie. The next movie I want to talk about is The Hitcher, which is a freaking amazing movie. Like, I love the crap out of this movie. Now, The Hitcher is about this young kid who picks up this guy hitchhiking, and then the guy tries to kill him, but he manages to push this guy out of his car and drive away. But then later on, this hitchhiker starts killing people, and he manages to pin the crimes on this kid, so now this kid is on the run from the police. And The Hitcher is a brilliant movie, and and the film stars Rutger Hauer as the main villain, and Rutger Hauer's performance in this movie is one of the best villain performances of all time, in my opinion, and C. Thomas Howell and Jennifer Jason Leigh are also really good in this film as well. And the film also stars Jeffrey DeMond, who would go on to be in films like the 1988 remake of The Blob and The Green Mile, and he would also go on to play Dale in The Walking Dead. The next movie I want to talk about is a 1986 anthology film called From a Whisper to a Scream, which I have on this DVD set here with several other Vincent Price films, and the film stars Vincent Price, and the film is also directed by Jeff Burr, who would go on to direct films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 and Pumpkinhead 2 and Puppet Master 4 and 5. But From a Whisper to a Scream is a really, really good anthology film. The next movie I want to talk about is James Cameron's Aliens, which is the sequel to Ridley Scott's Alien. Now, I love Aliens. I might even like this movie better than the first one. Like, Aliens might very well be my favorite film of the Alien franchise, and Aliens is definitely my favorite James Cameron movie. Now, Aliens is definitely more of an action film than a horror film, but there are some definite horror elements in this movie, and of course the film is a sequel to Alien, which is a horror film, so I chose to talk about this movie in this video, but once again, I adore Aliens. And I have Aliens on the Alien Quadrilogy box set. The next movie I want to talk about is David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly, which I love. Now, this isn't my favorite David Cronenberg movie, but this is definitely one of Cronenberg's best films, and I love the film, and in the movie, Jeff Goldblum gives a genuinely heartbreaking performance as this guy who is slowly changing into something that is not human. And it's a terrifying body horror film, but also a really heartbreaking tragedy story as well. Now, a lot of people claim that this is better than the original The Fly, but the thing is, though, the original The Fly is really close to my heart. Like, I've always enjoyed the original The Fly, so I really can't say this is better than the original, but this is definitely a very good remake, and definitely one of Cronenberg's best films. The next movie I want to talk about is Michael Mann's Manhunter. Now, the film is written and directed by Michael Mann and is based on the novel Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. And I have read the book, and this movie changes a lot from the book, but I think the movie does a good job at staying true to the themes of the novel and the spirit of the book, and truthfully, I actually think Michael Mann improved on some things from the book. Now, Manhunter is also the first film to feature the character of Hannibal Lecter, but in this film, Hannibal Lecter is really only a minor character, but The Silence of the Lambs was technically a sequel to this movie, but I love Manhunter. In my opinion, Manhunter is even better than Silence of the Lambs, and don't get me wrong, I love Silence of the Lambs, but I like Manhunter even better. This is actually one of my top 10 favorite films of all time. Now, Manhunter is definitely more of a crime drama film than a horror film, but there are definitely some horror elements in this movie. Now, I actually have 2 copies of this movie. I used to actually have the film on VHS, but I got rid of the VHS only because the VHS I had of this movie was starting to get worn out, but I have this DVD of the film, but I also have the director's cut of Manhunter. Now, the director's cut of the film is technically better, and there's a lot more character moments in the director's cut, but I actually kind of prefer the theatrical version, and the only reason I prefer the theatrical version is because this is the version of the film that I used to watch all the time growing up, so really this is my preferred version, only because this is the version of the film I have seen more often. The next movie I want to talk about is Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, and this is one of the most disturbing and brutal films I have ever seen in my life, and this is definitely a brutally realistic portrait of what a serial killer's life would actually be. Now, the film is about this man named Henry, played by Michael Rooker, who is a serial killer, and eventually he tells his friend Otis about what he does, and then him and his friend Otis go out on a killing spree, and it's a brutal film, and even though Henry is really the brains in that duo, arguably Otis, I would say, is a more evil character than Henry, but you'll understand if you watch the movie. But Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer is a really scary movie because it's real-world horror. It's something that could really happen, and there's nothing supernatural in the movie at all. It's a really realistic portrait of what the life of a serial killer would actually be like, and this movie, like, the final shot of this movie is so freaking haunting. Now, the movie is very loosely based on the crimes of Henry Lee Lucas. Now, I'm going to end this video off here, and I'm going to continue with a part 5, and hopefully part 5 will be the final part of this series of videos.